Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial, a museum and research center dedicated to preserving and presenting the history of General Douglas MacArthur, which includes the story of World War I and that of the millions of men and women who served in that war. This podcast features an interview with Megan Good, the director of the J. Wells Henderson Archives and Library at the Seaport Museum in Philadelphia. This podcast will focus on the USS Olympia and her service during World War I. Flagship of Commodore George Dewey during the Spanish-American War, the Olympia was a ship close to the hearts of Americans in the early 20th century. She would play a very different role in World War I, that of a diplomat, humanitarian aid ship, and she would also hold the distinct honor of being the vessel that was charged with returning the body of the World War II unknown soldier to the United States. We hope you enjoy this discussion. We are here today with Megan Good, the archivist of the J. Wells Henderson Archives and Library. My name is Amanda Williams, and we're going to be talking about the USS Olympia during World War I. Megan, why don't you just give us a brief overview of the Olympia right at the start of the war?
Sure. Well, after the Battle of Manila Bay and Olympia's major role as the flagship, the Navy changed from that time. There weren't any major conflicts after the Spanish-American War in American history, and the fleet got a little bit older. She was retrofitted and kept up, but it wasn't to the same standards and level as the current ships that were being built. So Olympia was used as a training ship until World War I broke out, and of course the United States didn't enter World War I until 1917, so we had a very short span of life for World War I. But she did not serve as primary role as she did during the Battle of Manila Bay. She served more as a supplementary role, where she helped with humanitarian missions, did some brief expeditions as well, but was really put on almost the second burner compared to her role in the Battle of Manila Bay, where she was the number one ship. By World War I, she was still a great ship, still very well known, but was not the lead of actions.
Okay, and what is the main reason for that? Is she just outclassed by this time?
She was. By World War I, she was already over 20 years old by that point, which we don't think, is that old necessarily for a ship. But when you consider the technology advances just between the 1890s and 1910 or 1912 even, it's completely different. Even when you look at passenger liners and steamers of the time, like the Titanic and the Olympic and other ships, they were twice as large as Olympia, twice as fast. And, of course, the Navy ships that were being built were just the same way.
Can you describe a few of the missions that she undertakes during the war?
Sure. The Olympia, two of the major things that she did during World War I, one was an expedition to the Arctic area to Murmansk, Russia. And basically that's around the same time also as the Russian Civil War. And so Olympia brought in Allied troops to help with the Russian Revolution, again, serving almost as America's somewhat diplomat, serving America's interests in the revolution. So she was up in Murmansk area, Archangel, which is very, very north. And she was up there for a little while, supplied troops, supplied cargo, some goods, provisions. And then the other half of her time was spent down in the Mediterranean as a humanitarian ship. So we have reports of sailors that were aboard Olympia at this time. And Olympia was seen still as, the ship of diplomacy, but in a different light. Not so much, the Iron Hammer that she was in Battle of Manila Bay, but as the humanitarian ship. So she brought provisions to Italy. She spent a lot of time in Venice and Rome. And there's accounts that we have of, during Christmas time, of Olympia sailors giving gifts to orphans and children that were crippled during the war or lost their parents. And they come aboard the Olympia, and we have these photos of them, and they get to meet the sailors, and they're playing around with them, and they're giving them presents. And it was a way of kind of like how America, sort of operates today during war, okay, where, we would go and really help the people humanitarian-wise, also have that underlayer of diplomacy, trying to, have a,
backed up by steel.
Exactly. Trying to have our own agenda in the mix as well, saying, well, we're helping you, which is great, it's great for mankind, but also we're helping you so you have a good representation and a good idea of what Americans are. So there's still a little bit of that, underlying American diplomacy, but at the same time, it very much, helped the lives of many children, many families in the area, and with all the different blockades and everything else during World War I, Italy and the entire Mediterranean was cut off from the rest of Europe and goods and everything else. Another major thing around this time was the Spanish flu epidemic. And so Olympia also helped with that. Her crew did take care of people aboard, or not people aboard, of people on shore. They also delivered medicine. Olympia, when you go aboard her, you also see she had areas for surgeons, medical people, corpsmen, and that as well. And they also really helped to educate the public through, best practices of, what to do, how to not hopefully get the flu, what to do when you have it, and preventative measures as well.
And this is in the United States?
This is in Europe at the time.
Okay.
So, Spanish flu at this time was Spanish flu didn't really hit the United States until after World War I, when soldiers and sailors brought it back, unfortunately. But during this time, it was very, very large.
So this is just a continuation of her humanitarian mission?
Yep.
Okay. Can you tell me anything about the daily lives of these World War I sailors that were aboard the Olympia?
Sure. Compared to the other sailors, necessarily from Battle of Manila Bay, that were focused more on, the war effort, or hopefully going to see action, the sailors that were aboard Olympia during this time had not an easier life by any means, but their focus was completely different. Of course, when Olympia delivered troops to Murmansk and to Archangel, they were different. That was a completely different mission. But during the whole humanitarian efforts of the ship, she had musicians aboard. She had, the sailors acted not just as sailors, but more of compassionate Americans as well.
So there was a sense that you have a mission, but it kind of goes beyond the war. This is kind of like a very diplomatic mission. We remain like a flagship of the United States.
Exactly. All throughout Olympia's time, there were actually musicians aboard her, and she had a band, which a lot of people don't realize. We have great photographs and stories from different people that were musicians aboard. And of course, seen as a flagship, and they were entertaining foreign dignitaries. Of course, music is a part of that entertainment. And the same happened during World War I. We actually have the collection of a sailor. He was a musician who played the trombone. And, we have images of him, and when they would have band concerts for the children that would come aboard, and they would walk through the streets of Venice and through Rome and all the other small, cities along the coastline, and perform concerts for the citizens of the small towns and cities. And, we think of that today as that doesn't happen when we're, in our current world state of diplomacy. But back then, the sailors aboard Olympia were really regular people as well as, fighting men. But their humanitarian efforts were almost the primary purpose of their time aboard.
So their job was to win the hearts and minds, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
And it seems like they did that through the photos that we have.
So take us to the very end of the war, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, at the end of the war, Olympia participated in a lot of the other ships that were deployed to the Mediterranean, deployed to the North Atlantic Ocean, and brought back American troops and Canadian troops from World War I. As just like in World War II, as soon as any conflict ends, the major focus is bringing everyone home. Unfortunately, during World War I, there were a lot of soldiers and sailors injured, so a lot of them convalesced in Europe for years after the war ended. So Olympia made not just one trip, but many trips back and forth to France, to England, not so much the Mediterranean anymore, but really just focused on France, where the heavy fighting was. And then she came back to the States for a while until the Unknown Soldier Memorial was declared, and the declaration for that was finalized. and she then went back to France to carry the unknown soldier home from World War I.
And I've heard that when she actually leaves France, she's accompanied for a short while by French battleships, kind of as kind of a honor guard.
She did.
This fallen soldier.
She did. She left the coast of France at, I'm going to butcher this pronouncing, but it's like Le Havre. And so she left there, and when she was going out of port, I mean, they had this massive ceremony. Basically, the unknown soldier was selected from 4 caskets of unknown soldiers, and one was randomly selected. And then, of course, once they were selected, they were paraded all the way down through the streets. People lined up, were watching it. People were really celebrating it, just like in World War I, how the French, were really celebrated, the Americans coming through and helping them as well. It was the same for World War I. And so, the casket with the flag draped over it would, be led through all the streets of the towns until it got to the harbor. There was a massive send-off, and then the Olympia at lead was followed by a French convoy, I think until international waters, and then she traveled by herself until Washington Navy Yard, and at Washington Navy Yard she was met by a fleet of American ships that followed her up, and then, of course, at the Navy Yard in Washington, the casket was taken off the ship, and meanwhile, the entire time, the ship was decorated for this voyage, so it had the black fabric hanging over the casket. It had flowers. I mean, it was like the biggest mausoleum almost of the time, traveling all the way from France, bringing the unknown soldier back. And then loaded the casket and through this massive procession at Washington Navy Yard. And then, of course, they proceeded over to Arlington National Cemetery, where I think a few days later the actual burial took place at the unknown soldier tomb.
Very interesting. Why was the Olympia accorded this honor? Because I'm sure by this time she's, maybe even considered a little more ancient by some people. But is it because of her kind of storied history as this kind of diplomatic vessel?
Yes. Olympia was chosen out of all the other ships of the Navy because of her storied history. She was seen as the ship, not just with Dewey, but the ship that won the Spanish-American War. Even though there were many other ships that participated in the war and sailed, and sailors and soldiers on land as well, she was still heralded as that flagship, and was seen as a source of American diplomacy and American pride. It's similar almost today to how you'd put it in current terms, almost to how the new ships like the USS New York that was just launched with pieces of the World Trade Center steel in her. She was almost. We don't herald that as much as what people back then did to Olympia. And that's, so you can just imagine all the love and, brotherhood felt about that ship and patriotic, love towards her. And so that's why she was chosen. She was, still not as popular as what she was right after the Battle of Manila Bay, but she was still beloved in the hearts of Americans.
Okay.
And was seen as, the ship to do the honors to carry back the first unknown soldier.
And today we are actually sitting right outside where the USS Olympia is docked. Visitors today can come aboard and visit the ship. And we also are sitting in the J. Wells Henderson Archives and Library, which has an absolutely fabulous collection about the ship in the Spanish-American War, and then again carrying back the unknown soldier. Is there... if people want to come here, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. Well, we have a large Olympia collection, obviously relating to the ship herself. The Seaport Museum has everything almost relating to the Olympia, as we like to say. But, our collection is open to the public for research. If visitors come to the Seaport Museum just because they're interested, they can go aboard the ship. They can see objects from the Olympia or about the Olympia in our Olympia gallery. And then if they're very interested, they can also schedule an appointment in the archives and library and see personal papers and manuscripts from sailors aboard the Olympia, see things from Dewey and all throughout her illustrious career of the Navy. To do that, we have the Seaport Museum is active on Facebook and Twitter and has an active website, and I invite everyone to go and learn more about the Seaport Museum through those ways.
Well, thank you, Megan. I think this was a very informative discussion about the Olympia, and I hope that lots of people will look into this a little bit more.
All right, thank you, Amanda.
Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please contact Amanda Williams at amanda.williams@norfolk.gov.